She fired him on a Tuesday morning, shook his hand at the door, and by the following Tuesday, her company was bleeding out on the floor, and she was the only one who understood exactly how the wound had been made. This is not a story about revenge. Patrick Lund never touched a single line of code after he left that building. He never made a phone call, never sent an email, never whispered a word to a competitor or a journalist or a disgruntled client. He packed his coffee thermos, his framed photo of his daughter's first swim meet, and a single sticky note he'd kept on his monitor for 4 years. And he walked out of the Halcyon Group's Chicago offices like a man walking out of a dentist appointment. Calm, quiet, already somewhere else in his mind. And that right there was precisely the problem. Because Renata Hale didn't fire a difficult employee that Tuesday morning. She didn't fire a troublemaker or a slacker or someone who had checked out. She thought she did. She genuinely, completely, with full confidence believed she was making a bold leadership decision that would finally move her company forward. What she actually did was pull the keystone out of an arch she didn't know she was standing under. And for the first 24 hours, nothing happened. The arch held. The walls looked fine. The light still came through the windows exactly the way it always had. But stone by stone, brick by brick, over the 7 days that followed, everything Patrick Lund had quietly, invisibly, painstakingly built, every system, every safeguard, every carefully worded relationship, every late-night fix that never made it into a meeting agenda, began to come apart at the seams. And Renata Hale, sitting in her corner office on the 14th floor, watching her phone light up with calls she didn't want to take, an email she couldn't answer fast enough, knew. She knew exactly what she'd done. But here's what makes this story different from every other story about a boss who fires the wrong person. It's not just about what Patrick built. It's about what he knew and what he'd been quietly protecting her from for 3 years without ever once telling her. Stay with this one, because the part that'll really get you doesn't come until day 6. If you're new to Crest Stories, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we tell real-life stories like this every single day. And if you've been here before, you already know we don't rush these. We let them breathe. So settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back about 4 years to a version of the Halcyon Group that looked very different from the company it would eventually become. In those days, Halcyon was a mid-sized marketing analytics firm based in Chicago's West Loop. They had around 60 employees, a handful of solid mid-market clients, and the kind of modest reputation that gets you steady work, but not the big contracts. Renata Hale had founded the company 7 years earlier with a business partner who eventually bought out his own stake and left quietly. Since then, she'd been running it alone, which, depending on the day and who you asked, was either her greatest strength or her most glaring blind spot. Renata was sharp, genuinely sharp, the kind of sharp that fills a room without trying. She had a memory for data that made her analysts nervous and a way of presenting to clients that made them feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of their problems, which on most days she was. She'd grown Halcyon from 11 people to 60 through sheer force of will, and the company bore her fingerprints on everything from the client intake process to the color of the coffee cups in the break room. But running a growing company is a different skill set from building one. And somewhere around year 5, the seams had started to show, not in the parts of the business that Renata could see, but in the parts she'd never thought to look at. That's where Patrick Lund came in. Patrick had been hired as Director of Systems Operations, a title that, at most companies, sounds more important than it is. You picture someone who manages the IT tickets and makes sure the printers stay connected. And if you'd asked most of Halcyon's 60 employees what Patrick actually did, they would have given you some version of that description. Nice guy, quiet, always seemed to be working on something. Kept the tech running. Made sure the reports went out on time. What they didn't see was that Patrick Lund had spent his first 6 months at Halcyon doing something most operations people never bother to do. He mapped the company. Not just the org chart, not just the software stack. He mapped the actual nervous system of Halcyon Group. Every process that touched every other process, every client relationship that depended on a piece of infrastructure that nobody had formally documented, every internal workflow that lived in someone's head instead of in a manual. He built spreadsheets that cross-referenced client contracts with their technical delivery requirements. He wrote internal guides that nobody asked him to write. He built automated systems that quietly replaced tasks 3 different people had been doing manually for years, and then told those 3 people what he'd done, so they didn't feel like he was cutting them out, just freeing them up. He was in the quiet and careful language of operations people, exceptional. And he had a habit that would eventually define his entire tenure at Halcyon. When Patrick found a problem, a billing error, a data inconsistency, a client report that had been going out with slightly skewed numbers for 6 months, he fixed it, quietly, without making a big presentation out of it. He'd send a brief email to whoever needed to know, note it in his internal log, and move on. He didn't wave flags. He didn't build slides about it. He didn't walk into Renata's office and say, "I just saved the company from a lawsuit." He just fixed it and moved on to the next thing. At the time, Renata appreciated this. In fact, she actively celebrated it in team meetings. "This is the kind of culture we're building," she'd say. "People who solve problems instead of dramatizing them." And she meant it genuinely. She valued quiet competence. She'd been burned earlier in the company's life by employees who specialized in announcing problems without actually solving them, who'd perfected the art of the meeting that led to another meeting. Patrick was the antidote to all of that. But there was something Renata hadn't fully processed about the way Patrick worked. When you fix problems quietly, the people around you stop knowing that the problems existed. And when you stop knowing that the problems existed, you stop knowing that someone was fixing them. And when you stop knowing that someone was fixing them, you start to wonder what exactly that person is doing all day. Here's the thing about Renata Hale in year 6 of running Halcyon. She had started to change, not in a way she would have admitted to anyone, maybe not even to herself. But the people who'd been there from the beginning noticed it. Greta Finch, her COO, had been watching it happen slowly. Doug Farrell, who ran sales, had started choosing his words more carefully in leadership meetings. Even Sandra Kemp in HR had begun keeping better notes of her conversations with Renata, not out of malice, just out of a quiet professional instinct. What changed was the board. About 2 years before this story takes place, Halcyon had taken on a significant round of outside investment from a private equity group led by a man named Troy Albright. Troy was the kind of investor who didn't just write checks. He had opinions. Opinions about headcount, about margins, about the pace of growth, about the composition of the leadership team. He had a particular vocabulary he used in board meetings, right-sizing high-leverage talent, eliminating redundancy. And Renata, who needed his money and his network and the credibility he brought to her fundraising story, had started to absorb some of that vocabulary. She had started to look at her company differently. Not worse exactly, just differently, through a different lens. The lens of a slide deck, the lens of a metric, the lens of what a particular headcount number looked like to the next group of investors she was trying to bring in. And in that lens, Patrick Lund was a problem. Not because he wasn't good, but because he was impossible to quantify in the way that mattered to Troy Albright's spreadsheets. You couldn't point to a revenue number and say, Patrick generated that. You couldn't put him on a slide and explain his contribution in one bullet point. His value was everywhere, and therefore, to someone looking for clean lines of accountability, it looked like it was nowhere. Troy had raised the question of operations overhead in 2 consecutive board meetings. He hadn't named Patrick specifically. He didn't need to. Renata had heard the question and started doing the mental math herself. There was also, if she was being honest with herself, and she mostly wasn't, a specific incident that had lodged itself under her skin. About 3 months before the firing, Renata had walked into a leadership meeting with a proposal she was genuinely excited about. She wanted to roll out a new client reporting format, a sleeker, more visual dashboard design that she thought would modernize Halcyon's presentation to clients and differentiate them from competitors. She'd been working on the concept with a design consultant, and she was proud of it. Patrick had listened to the whole presentation. He nodded in a few places. And then, when she was done, he'd asked a question in his calm, even voice, the voice that never rose or fell, that carried no drama whatsoever. How are we planning to handle the migration for the 11 clients currently on the legacy reporting pipeline? Because 3 of those contracts have SLA clauses that would make a unilateral format change a breach if we don't give 90 days notice. The room had gone quiet. Renata hadn't known about the SLA clauses. Neither had Greta. Neither had Doug. Patrick had known because he'd read every client contract. All of them. He'd cross-referenced them with the technical specs of the proposed new dashboard. He'd done this not because anyone asked him to, but because that was how Patrick operated. He didn't wait to be told what might break. He looked. Renata had thanked him, pivoted the meeting, and spent the drive home that night aware of a feeling she didn't particularly want to examine too closely. It wasn't gratitude, though it should have been. It was something more uncomfortable than gratitude. It was the feeling of being corrected in front of her team. It was the feeling of not having known something she felt she should have known. And it was the feeling, irrational, she told herself, completely irrational, that Patrick Lund had somehow done that to her on purpose. He hadn't, of course. He never did anything on purpose except his job. But feelings like that have a long shelf life. They sit in the back of a person's mind, and they marinate. And when Troy Albright raised the question of operational redundancy for the 3rd time 6 weeks later, Renata Hale was ready to answer it. The conversation with Sandra Kemp in HR took about 40 minutes. They called it a restructuring decision. They documented it as a role elimination, not a performance termination. Sandra had asked, twice, whether Renata wanted to explore a transition period, whether Patrick could stay on for 30 to 60 days to document his systems and hand off his responsibilities. Renata had said no. Clean break, she said. That's the best way to do these things. Sandra had written that down, kept it in her file. The morning of the Tuesday in question, Renata had arrived at the office early. She'd asked Patrick to come in at 8, earlier than usual, which, in retrospect, every person who worked at Halcyon would later say they should have recognized as a signal. Patrick didn't seem to recognize it either. He came in with his thermos and a folder of notes from a vendor call he'd been preparing for. He sat down across from Renata's desk. She told him directly, which at least was honest. No performance improvement plan, no long preamble about company values. She said the company was restructuring its operations model, that his role was being eliminated, and that Halcyon appreciated everything he'd contributed. His severance had already been calculated and HR had paperwork ready. His last day was today. There was a pause. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. Nobody threw anything. Nobody raised a voice. Patrick sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with everything. And then he asked one question. Is there anything you'd like me to walk someone through before I go? Any of the systems documentation, I should. We'll handle the transition internally, Renata said. We have Kevin Rowe coming in next week. Kevin Rowe was a management consultant. 34 years old, excellent PowerPoint skills, a track record of modernizing operations at 3 companies Renata had researched, all of which were larger than Halcyon, which she felt meant he was overqualified in exactly the right direction. Patrick nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't warn her. He didn't say a single word that could have been construed as a threat or a prediction, or even a meaningful observation. He signed what Sandra had prepared, shook Renata's hand with a grip that was firm and unhurried, collected his thermos and his photo and his sticky note, and walked to the elevator. The sticky note, Cassie Pruitt would later recall, had 4 words on it. She'd never been able to make them out clearly enough to read them. And that detail would bother her for years. What nobody at Halcyon understood yet, what Renata certainly didn't understand, was the specific nature of the architecture Patrick had built over 4 years. It wasn't just software. It wasn't just process documentation. It was a living system that Patrick maintained the way a gardener maintains a garden. Not through a single action, but through constant, small, regular attention. There were automated reports that ran beautifully because Patrick checked their outputs twice a week and quietly corrected for the drift that happened whenever client data came in formatted slightly differently than expected. There was a billing reconciliation process that looked fully automated but had 3 manual checkpoints that only Patrick ever touched because he discovered 18 months into his tenure that the underlying software had a rounding error that accumulated over billing cycles in a way that looked like noise until it didn't. There were client relationships that Patrick had quietly, carefully tended for 2 years. Not because he was supposed to, but because he noticed that certain clients had specific technical anxieties that nobody on the account team fully understood, and he'd started being available for those clients' internal IT teams, taking calls, answering questions, being the calm voice on the other end of the line when something looked wrong in a dashboard. He'd never put any of this in his performance review. He'd never flagged it as above and beyond. It was just part of the job, in his mind, the job being make sure everything works. And now he was gone. Kevin Rowe arrived the following Monday, 6 days after the firing, with a canvas tote bag full of notebooks and a personality that took up significant square footage. He was charming in the way that consultants who primarily work with leadership teams are charming. He spoke Renata's language fluently, referenced the right frameworks, validated her instincts consistently, and made Greta Finch feel good about decisions she'd already made. But the cracks had already started forming before Kevin walked through the door. On Wednesday, the day after Patrick left, Cassie Pruitt noticed something odd in the morning client report run. A data set for one of their mid-sized retail clients, a chain called Deering Home Goods whose account contact was a meticulous man named Walt Deering, had populated with null values in the regional breakdown segment. The automated system had run and hadn't flagged an error. It had simply passed the nulls through and included them in the formatted report as blank cells. Cassie caught it before the report went out. She fixed the surface-level issue manually, replacing the nulls with the correct values by pulling the data from the source, and sent it along. What she didn't do was dig into why it had happened. She didn't know to look for the underlying cause because she didn't know there was an underlying cause. As far as she could tell, it was a fluke. Data sometimes came in weird. She'd caught it. Problem solved. But the reason those nulls had appeared was something Patrick would have identified in 11 seconds. The retail client's data warehouse had updated their export format 2 days before Patrick was let go. Patrick had noticed the format change. He noticed everything, and had already written a parsing update in the system that would have corrected for it automatically. It was sitting in draft in his admin panel for lines of code, essentially complete, waiting for his final review before deployment. For lines of code that nobody else knew existed. In the meantime, the system was reading the new format through the old parser and producing nulls every time it hit the fields that had been renamed. Cassie had fixed Wednesday's report manually without knowing this. Thursday's report would have the same problem. Fridays would too. Every report, every day for this client quietly wrong in a way that took careful manual attention to catch. And that would eventually, if left long enough, start producing not nulls, but plausible-looking wrong numbers. Numbers that looked right. Numbers that would go unchecked. On Thursday, something else happened. A client named Walt Deering, who ran a careful, methodical operation and who had, over the past year, developed a habit of calling Patrick directly whenever a dashboard metric didn't make intuitive sense to him, called Halcyon's main line and asked to be connected to Patrick Lund. Sandra Kemp took the call, transferred it to Greta, who explained gently that Patrick was no longer with the company and that someone from the account team would be in touch. Walt said thank you in a polite, neutral voice and hung up. He didn't say he was concerned. He didn't say anything alarming. But Walt Deering's quarterly contract renewal was in 31 days, and he hadn't called just to chat. By Friday, 4 days after the firing, there was a texture to the office that the longer-tenured employees could feel but couldn't quite name. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even obvious tension. It was the sensation of reaching for something that should have been where you left it and finding empty space. A vendor that Patrick had been managing an SLA dispute with sent an email to the general operations inbox asking for an update on the resolution timeline. Nobody on the current team knew the dispute existed because Patrick had been handling it directly and had simply never needed to escalate it. Doug Farrell saw the email, didn't recognize the vendor name, forwarded it to Greta, who forwarded it to Sandra, who created a ticket for Kevin Rowe to investigate the following Monday. In the time it took that email to make those 3 hops, the vendor's dispute window, the window within which Halcyon was entitled to contest an erroneous charge on their service agreement, expired. The charge was $4,000, a small number. The kind of number that gets absorbed as miscellaneous operating expense and never discussed in a board meeting. Except that this was one charge. There were 6 other vendor relationships Patrick had been actively managing with the same level of quiet, personal attention. Each of them had their own timelines, their own nuances, their own specific contacts who sent emails to Patrick's address. An address that now auto-forwarded to a shared inbox that nobody was monitoring with any particular urgency. And here's the thing that nobody at Halcyon understood yet, the thing that Renata wouldn't fully understand until day 6. They were not dealing with one Patrick Lund-shaped hole in the organization. They were dealing with 40 of them. Small holes. Individually, each one manageable. The kind of thing you could patch with a few hours of focused attention if you knew it was there. But nobody knew they were there, because Patrick had been the only person who knew where all the holes were. Kevin Rowe arrived Monday morning, 6 days in, and spent his first day meeting with Greta and Renata and the heads of each functional team. He was good at listening. He took impressive notes. He had a framework. He always had a framework, and it was genuinely well-structured. He asked smart questions about the reporting infrastructure, the client relationship management system, the billing workflow. And every answer he got back was, in its own way, incomplete, because the person answering only knew the part of the system that they interacted with. Nobody had the full picture. Patrick had been the full picture. Kevin Rowe was patient and professional and entirely unaware that he was standing in a building where the load-bearing walls had already been quietly removed, and what was holding the structure up was 4 years of accumulated habit and muscle memory, which had a half-life, it turned out, of about 72 hours. Day 6, the Tuesday exactly 1 week after Patrick was fired, was the day that Renata Hale stopped sleeping. It started with an email from Walt Deering. Not a phone call, not a forwarded complaint, a direct email written in the even, deliberate prose of a man who had made a decision and was communicating it as a courtesy rather than an opening for negotiation. He thanked Halcyon for their service. He noted that the quality of their reporting had declined noticeably in the past week. 3 specific reports cited, with the exact dates and the exact anomalies documented in a neatly bulleted attachment. He said that given this pattern, and given the departure of their primary technical contact, his company would not be renewing their contract at month's end. He wished Renata's team well. That contract was worth $420,000 annually. Renata read the email twice. Then she walked to Greta's office and closed the door. What happened in that conversation, what Greta would later describe to Sandra as the meeting I've been dreading for 2 years, was the moment Renata stopped being able to explain the problems away. Because Greta, who was loyal to Renata in the way that competent COOs often are, had been keeping a quiet list. Not a formal document, not a grievance record, just a list in her own handwriting, in a notebook she kept in her desk drawer, of the things that had gone wrong in the past 6 days that didn't have a clear owner. The things that had surfaced, been looked at with confusion, and been set aside because nobody had the time or the context to dig into them properly. There were 14 items on the list. The null value reports, the vendor dispute that had lapsed, 2 client dashboards that had been running on cache data since Thursday because something in the refresh schedule had stopped firing and nobody had caught it, which meant 2 clients had been looking at 5-day-old information and presenting it in their own internal meetings as current. A billing discrepancy that Sandra had flagged that morning. Not large, but also not explainable by any process anyone could identify. A report subscription for a client named Farrow and Tillis that had simply stopped sending on Friday with no error log, no alert, no trace of why. And 1 item at the bottom of the list that Greta had written down and then starred twice because it was the one she understood the least. 3 weeks before Patrick was let go, he had apparently sent an email to a technical contact at Halcyon's cloud infrastructure provider. In that email, which Greta had only found because she'd gotten access to Patrick's email archive that morning, he had flagged a potential capacity issue in their data storage allocation. He described it clearly, offered a specific solution, and asked the provider to confirm receipt and begin the remediation process. The provider had responded. They confirmed receipt. They'd said they were initiating the process. And then Patrick was gone before the process was completed. The remediation was 70% done. The remaining 30% involved a manual configuration step on Halcyon's end that required administrator credentials. Patrick's credentials, which had been deactivated the morning he was let go. Greta read that item on her list to Renata slowly, making sure she understood what it meant. If the storage allocation wasn't corrected within the next 72 hours, their data infrastructure would hit capacity. When that happened, the automated reporting system wouldn't crash dramatically. It would do something quieter and worse. It would begin silently failing writes. Data would stop being stored correctly. Reports would go out appearing normal, but drawing from corrupted data sets. Their clients wouldn't know immediately. Neither would Halcyon. It could be 3 days before anyone noticed something was wrong. By then, the data would be compromised in ways that were difficult to reverse and potentially impossible to fully audit. Renata sat in the chair across from Greta's desk and was quiet for a very long time. And then she said something that Greta Finch would remember for the rest of her professional life. He knew, not as an accusation, not with anger. She said it the way you say something when the ground has shifted under you and you're trying to figure out whether your legs still work. Patrick knew this was coming. That's why he flagged it 3 weeks ago. He was trying to fix it before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Here's what nobody had told Renata, what no one had ever put directly in front of her in language she was forced to confront, was the specific nature of what Patrick Lund had been quietly protecting her from for 3 years. It was Cassie Pruitt who found it. Cassie, who was 26 and had been at Halcyon for 2 years, and who had a quality that made her quietly invaluable in exactly the way Patrick had been. She noticed things. She had been given access to Patrick's documentation files as part of the scramble to understand what they were dealing with. Folder by folder, document by document, she'd been working through his archive since Monday afternoon. And on the evening of day 6, sitting at her desk at 7:30 with a takeout container going cold beside her keyboard, she opened a folder labeled simply Ongoing, Do Not Archive. Inside were 62 documents. Some were technical, system logs, configuration files, vendor SLA records. But some were something else entirely. There was a folder within the folder called Client Reconciliation Notes. Inside were 12 documents, one for each of Halcyon's major client accounts. And each document was a record, quiet, meticulous, written in Patrick's flat, factual style, of errors in the data that Halcyon had delivered to that client, corrections Patrick had made before the data went out, and in some cases corrections Patrick had made after the data went out. In follow-up reports, he'd quietly reissued and walked clients through with explanations framed as system updates, rather than what they actually were. Mistakes. Renata's mistakes, mostly, or the mistakes of the account teams, operating under processes Renata had designed and that Patrick had spent 4 years quietly, invisibly proofing. There was a document specifically about the reporting format project, the proposal Renata had presented in that meeting, the one where Patrick had asked about the SLA clauses. The document showed that Patrick had identified 7 other issues with the proposal beyond the SLA question: technical implementation problems, data integrity risks, timeline conflicts with existing client commitments. He noted them all in the document. He'd addressed the SLA clause in the meeting because it was the most immediate and legally significant concern. He had never mentioned the other 6, because he'd already figured out how to solve them quietly if the project had moved forward. Cassie sat with that folder open on her screen for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Greta. Greta called Renata. Renata asked them both to come to her office. It was 8:45 at night. She read through the documents for 2 hours. When she was done, she sat back in her chair and looked out at the Chicago skyline through her floor-to-ceiling windows. The city's still bright and awake even at this hour. Cars moving far below, lights still on in the office towers across the street. She looked like a person who had just been handed information about themselves that they hadn't asked for and couldn't give back. "He never told me," she said. "No," Greta agreed. "He just fixed it, all of it, for 4 years, and never told me." Cassie was quiet. She was young enough to understand the weight of what was in those documents, but careful enough to let Renata feel it in her own time. "If I'd known," Renata started, and then she stopped, because the sentence didn't go anywhere useful. If she'd known what? She would have valued him differently? She would have been less embarrassed by that moment in the meeting, because she'd have understood that him catching her mistakes was a feature, not a humiliation. She would have been more likely to see the board's question about operational overhead as a threat rather than a reasonable efficiency question. Maybe. Probably. But also, and this was the part that really cut, if she'd known, she would have had to acknowledge that she wasn't the one holding the company together as elegantly as she believed. And Renata Hale had built her identity around being the one who held the company together. The storage infrastructure issue had a 72-hour window. Patrick had been gone for 6 days. Renata picked up her phone. She called him at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Renata." His voice was exactly the way it had always been, even unhurried, carrying no particular temperature. "Patrick." She closed her eyes for a second. I don't know how to start this conversation." There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, just Patrick giving her space to find her footing the way he always had. "That's okay," he said. "We have a situation with the cloud storage. The capacity issue you flagged with Corsten infrastructure." Yeah, he already knew what she was going to say. Of course he did. The remediation process is 70% complete. The last step needs admin credentials executed on a specific config file in the deployment dashboard. It has to be done before Thursday morning or the right functions start throttling. I know. She paused. Is there any way you could? And here's where you might expect him to hesitate. To let her sit in it. To make her work for it, even a little. To say something pointed or satisfying or even just honest about the position she'd put herself in. He didn't. I can walk someone through it remotely, he said. It'll take about 30 minutes if the person has admin access. Does Cassie have admin access yet? Renata looked across the office at Cassie, who was watching her with wide, careful eyes. She will by the time you call. Okay. A brief pause. Send her my number. I'll call in an hour. And Renata, he stopped for a moment, the way he always stopped when he was choosing his words. You should also have Kevin pull the vendor SLA files from the archive. The Brecker-Simon agreement specifically. There's a renewal clause that activates automatically in 19 days if it isn't terminated in writing. It's a clause that Patrick had flagged for termination 3 months ago because the contract wasn't performing. If it auto-renews, you're locked in for another 18 months at a rate that's about 40% above market. A long pause. How do you know Kevin hasn't already found it? Because if he had, you would have called me sooner. She didn't have an answer to that. I'll have Cassie ready, she said. Good. And then, because she needed to say something, even if it landed imperfectly. Patrick, I think I made a... It's okay, he said. He said it without condescension and without warmth, in that particular tone of his that was simply neutral, not cold, not forgiving, just absent of the need to make the moment bigger than it was. He said it the way you say it to someone when you've already decided how you feel about a situation, and the apology, while noted, doesn't actually change the facts. I'll talk to Cassie in an hour, he said. And he hung up. Cassie spent 58 minutes with Patrick Lund on the phone that night. He walked her through the configuration step with the kind of patience that made her want to cry a little, not out of sadness, but out of the specific emotion you feel when you realize you've been in the presence of someone excellent without knowing it. He explained each step before she took it. He told her what to look for, what the correct output should look like, and what to do if it didn't look right. When it was done and the configuration verified and the storage issue resolved, she thanked him. He said it was no problem. She asked. She wasn't sure why she asked, but something made her ask whether he'd be okay. And he laughed. It was a short laugh, quiet and genuinely amused. Yeah, he said. I'll be okay. I actually start at VenturePoint next week. VenturePoint. Cassie knew that name. Everyone at Halcyon knew that name. VenturePoint was one of the 2 or 3 firms that Halcyon benchmarked themselves against when pitching to clients. They weren't quite a direct competitor. Their market position was adjacent, overlapping in a few key verticals. Or they had been, up until about 3 weeks ago, when they'd apparently hired away Halcyon's director of systems operations. Cassie hung up and sat in the dim office for a while. Then she went to Renata's office and told her. Renata already knew. She looked it up while Cassie was on the phone. It's probably fine, Renata said. Her voice said otherwise. He can't take anything proprietary with him. There's an NDA. Cassie nodded. She didn't point out that Patrick Lund had never needed proprietary information to do his job. What Patrick knew wasn't about Halcyon's client lists or their pricing models or their data algorithms. What Patrick knew was how things worked, and that knowledge lived entirely inside his head. The Halcyon Group did not collapse. It's important to say that clearly because this story could easily be read as a collapse story, and it isn't. Not quite. Companies are more resilient than the moments that test them, and Renata Hale, whatever her failures of perception and pride, was not a passive person. When she understood the shape of the problem, She moved on it with the same force she'd always applied to obstacles. In the weeks that followed, she brought in a specialized operations consultant. Not Kevin Rowe, who was let go with professional courtesy after his first real attempt to rebuild the system's infrastructure, produced something that looked impressive in a slide deck and failed the very first time a client dataset pushed through it. The new consultant was a woman named Dr. Petra Vance, who specialized in operations archaeology, which sounds made up but is genuinely a thing. The practice of excavating the actual systems and processes inside a company, as opposed to the ones listed in their official documentation. Petra Vance spent 3 weeks going through Patrick's documentation. She called it, in a conversation with Renata that Renata would later describe as the most humbling meeting of my professional life. The single most comprehensive internal knowledge base she had ever encountered at a company of halcyon size. She also noted, with clinical precision, that this was precisely the problem. Everything Patrick knew about your company lived in a system he built and maintained personally, she told Renata. That's not a sustainable architecture. It doesn't matter how good he was, and he was exceptional. You can't build institutional resilience around a single person's understanding. That's not his failure. It's a leadership failure. Renata had nodded and written that down. She would quote it in the board meeting with Troy Albright 2 weeks later. A meeting she had asked for and prepared for and walked into without the safety net of having pre-gamed Troy's reactions. She laid out what had happened. All of it. The system's gaps, the client losses, the near-data catastrophe, the document Cassie had found that showed 3 years of quiet error correction that had never been disclosed or formally understood. Troy Albright was not pleased, but he was, to his credit, a practical man. And the practical reality was that Halcyon was salvageable. 3 clients had been lost. Walt Deering's contract, as promised, had not renewed, along with 2 others who had noticed the reporting quality decline and chosen not to mention it until they'd already decided to leave. But the remaining client base was intact. The data infrastructure had been stabilized, and Petra Vance had begun the process of rebuilding the operations architecture in a way that distributed institutional knowledge across 3 roles instead of concentrating it in one. The board approved a restructuring plan. Sandra Kemp, who had kept every note from every conversation about Patrick's termination in a file labeled with the name of the case, filed it away under resolved and said nothing more about it. Doug Farrell, who had liked Patrick and quietly known something was wrong from the moment he'd walked out the door, went back to doing what he did best and said nothing more about it either. Cassie Pruitt was promoted to a newly created role, Knowledge Systems Lead. It was essentially an attempt to do intentionally what Patrick had done instinctively, to make sure that the understanding of how the company worked was documented, shared, distributed, and never again dependent on any single person holding it in their memory. She was good at it. She would be even better when she stopped trying to do it the way Patrick had done it, alone, quietly, invisibly, and started doing it the way her new job title described, in the open, collaboratively, as a function of the organization rather than a heroic individual act. Renata took longer. Not with the operational changes, those she managed with characteristic efficiency, but with the internal accounting. The reckoning that happens not in a board meeting or a consultant's presentation, but in the quiet of a Tuesday morning when you're sitting at your desk and a particular thought arrives and you have to decide whether to let yourself look at it or to stay busy and send it away. The thought, when she finally let herself look at it, was this. She had made a decision about Patrick Lund that was based entirely on how she felt around him. Not what he produced, not what he contributed, not the objective evidence of his value, which was everywhere if you knew where to look. She had made the decision based on the feeling of being corrected in front of people and the need to give a board member's vocabulary a name to attach to, and the slow accumulation of discomfort that comes from being near someone whose competence makes you aware of the gaps in your own. And she addressed that decision in the language of strategy, restructuring, operational efficiency, modernizing the role. She had used the language of leadership to execute something that was fundamentally about her own ego. And 60 employees had felt the consequences of that. 3 clients had left. $400,000 of annual revenue was gone. A vendor dispute had cost money that didn't need to be spent. And the systems that 12 people now worked 3 months to reconstruct could have remained stable with a single conversation. A real one. Not the transaction she'd staged that Tuesday morning, with a man who had given 4 years of meticulous, invisible labor to a company that had finally looked up long enough to see him and decided he wasn't visible enough. She sat with that for a while. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting an agenda for a leadership meeting, the first item of which was titled, in language she chose carefully, "Understanding What We Don't Know About Our Own Company." It was a beginning, not an absolution, not a resolution, just a beginning. Patrick Lund started at VenturePoint on a Monday, same as he always started things, early, prepared, already 2 steps ahead of the questions anyone thought to ask him. His office was smaller than the one at Halcyon. He didn't seem to notice. On his first day, he met with his new team, 5 people, a mix of technical and operational experience, all of them sharp in their own ways. He sat down with each of them for 30 minutes and asked the same question. What's the one part of how this company runs that you think everyone assumes works fine, but that you're personally not sure about? Each of them had an answer. He wrote them all down. On his desk in the new office, he put the same framed photo, his daughter mid-dive at a swim meet, suspended for one perfect moment above the water. And beside it, a new sticky note, because the old one had been from a different chapter. The new note had 4 words on it too. Nobody at VenturePoint was close enough yet to read it. But if they'd leaned in, they would have seen that it said, "Fix it before it breaks." It was not a warning. It was not a philosophy or a slogan or a mission statement. It was just the way Patrick Lund showed up every single day of his professional life. In buildings full of people who were too busy building slides about the future to notice the person quietly keeping the present from falling apart. Until the day he wasn't there anymore, and the slides couldn't tell them where the floor had gone. There's a version of this story that ends with Renata calling Patrick and him coming back, with a reconciliation, a raise, an acknowledgement, and a company all-hands meeting. That version is neater. It's more comfortable, but it isn't what happened. Patrick didn't go back. He had no reason to, and he wasn't the kind of person who required a narrative arc to move on from something. He'd made his peace the morning he walked out with his thermos. He knew what he'd built at Halcyon. He didn't need a ceremony around it. The real ending of this story is smaller than that. It's a Tuesday morning, about 4 months after the firing, and Renata is in a leadership meeting. One of the newer operations hires, a young woman who joined through Petrovance's restructuring plan, is presenting a quarterly systems review. She's thorough. She's prepared. She's flagged 3 potential issues before they became problems, and she's presenting the solutions alongside the problems, the way Patrick always had. At the end of her presentation, Renata thanks her. Not the brief, efficient thank you she used to give Patrick, or the kind that gets absorbed into the next agenda item before the warmth of it can settle. She thanks her by name, specifically, and asks her to explain one of the solutions in more detail. Not because Renata doesn't understand it, but because she wants the rest of the leadership team to hear it and understand it. She wants them to see the person doing the work. It's a small thing. The young woman doesn't know how much Renata is paying for the lesson that produced that moment. Nobody in the room does. But Greta Finch, who has seen every version of Renata Hale in 6 years of working side by side, notices. She writes one word in the margin of her notebook. Different. Not fixed, Not redeemed, not transformed in the dramatic, finished way that good stories sometimes promise. Just different. Which, if you've ever tried to change a habit of mind that you've spent 30 years building without knowing you're building it, you know that different is everything. Different is the whole game. So the next time someone in your office seems to be coasting, seems to be quiet, seems to be invisible, seems to be doing a job that you can't explain in a single slide, before you let a board member's vocabulary put a number on them, sit with that feeling for a minute. Because there is a version of your company that exists only because of the things that person catches before anyone else sees them. And you will not know that's true until the day they're not there to catch them anymore. Patrick Lund knew that. He just never felt the need to say it out loud. He figured the work would speak for itself. He was right. It just took a week. If this story made you think of someone you know, or maybe someone you've been, drop a comment below. We read all of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because next story is about a woman who discovered, through a completely unrelated sequence of events, that her company's most valuable trade secret had been sitting in an employee handbook footnote for 11 years. Nobody had read that far. Almost nobody. We'll see you then.